February 24, 1944. 23,000 feet above Schweinfurt, Germany. Major Glenn Duncan pulled his P-47 Thunderbolt into a near-vertical dive, the massive 10-ton fighter accelerating past 400 miles per hour as German flak batteries far below erupted in desperate response. His target, a formation of Messerschmitt Bf-109s climbing to intercept the American bomber stream, had no idea he was coming. The Luftwaffe pilots had been trained to avoid this exact situation, taught in their briefing rooms that the American Thunderbolt pilots were reckless, undisciplined cowboys who threw away altitude advantage for fleeting attack opportunities. Their instructors called the P-47's diving attacks selbstmörderisch, suicidal, a waste of energy that any properly trained German fighter pilot could exploit in the turning fight that inevitably followed. But Duncan wasn't planning to turn. At 22,000 feet, with his dive speed building past 420 miles per hour, he opened fire. 8 50-caliber machine guns converged their streams on the lead Messerschmitt. The German fighter disintegrated. Pieces of wing, canopy, and fuselage scattered across the morning sky as Duncan's Thunderbolt roared past, already climbing back to altitude before the remaining German pilots could react. This was the 4th consecutive day of Operation Argument, what would become known as Big Week, the most intensive air campaign in history to that point. And the Luftwaffe was learning, far too late, that the American cowboys weren't reckless at all. They had simply rewritten the rules of fighter combat, and German pilots trained in the old ways were dying by the hundreds. The morning of February 20th, 1944, found the Reich's fighter forces at what appeared to be the peak of their strength. 2 years of strategic retreat and tactical adaptation had transformed the Luftwaffe from the overextended force that had failed over Britain into a concentrated defensive weapon designed for a single purpose: destroying American heavy bombers before they could level Germany's industrial cities. General Major Adolf Galland, General of Fighters, could count over 2,000 single-engine fighters available for the defense of the Reich, more than had been operational at any previous point in the war. The factories were still producing Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s faster than combat could destroy them. Dispersed production facilities, underground assembly lines, and slave labor had kept German fighter production climbing, even as Allied bombs fell on the major industrial centers. But Galland knew something his superiors in Berlin did not fully grasp. The numbers meant nothing if the pilots flying those fighters lacked the skill to use them. In the autumn of 1943, a Luftwaffe fighter pilot received an average of 210 hours of flight training before his first combat mission. By February of 1944, that figure had dropped to 160 hours. Some replacement pilots were arriving at operational squadrons with as little as 110 hours total flight time, barely enough to take off and land safely, let alone engage experienced American fighter pilots in combat. The Americans, by contrast, were producing pilots with 200 hours of training as a minimum, and many had considerably more. More critically, their training emphasized gunnery, formation flying, and the specific tactics needed to exploit the strengths of their aircraft. The P-47 Thunderbolt pilots graduating from the fighter replacement training units in the United States had logged dozens of hours learning exactly how to fight in the massive, powerful fighter that would carry them into combat over Europe. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Thunderbolt itself was an aircraft that defied conventional thinking about fighter design. At 13,000 pounds fully loaded, it weighed nearly twice as much as the Bf-109. Its Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine produced 2,000 horsepower, driving a 13-foot propeller that turned the air into thrust with brutal efficiency. The combination resulted in an aircraft that couldn't turn with German fighters at low or medium altitudes, climbed more slowly than a Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf, and consumed fuel at a rate that initially limited its combat radius to barely 200 miles. German intelligence officers examining crashed P-47s in 1943 had concluded it was poorly suited to the fighter role. Too heavy, too large, sacrificing agility for armor and firepower. Luftwaffe pilots who encountered the Thunderbolt in combat during its first months of operation reported that it was easy to evade in turning engagements, vulnerable to skilled pilots flying the nimble Bf-109 or the powerful FW-190. What the Germans failed to understand, what their training doctrine and combat experience had not prepared them to recognize, was that the P-47's apparent weaknesses were irrelevant if it never fought the way German pilots expected. The Thunderbolt couldn't turn with a Messerschmitt at 12,000 feet, but it didn't need to. Its dive speed exceeded 500 miles per hour, faster than any German fighter could safely achieve. Its climb rate at high altitude, above 20,000 feet, was superior to anything the Luftwaffe could field. And its structural strength allowed it to pull out of dives and execute high-speed maneuvers that would tear the wings off a Bf-109. Colonel Hubert Zemke, commanding officer of the 56th Fighter Group, had recognized these characteristics immediately when his unit received its first P-47s in the summer of 1942. A hard-eyed realist who had served as an observer with the Royal Air Force during the Battle of Britain, Zemke understood that the Thunderbolt required tactics specifically designed around its unique performance envelope. The result was a tactical doctrine that German pilots found incomprehensible. P-47 formations operated at altitudes between 25,000 and 30,000 feet, above the optimal performance range of German interceptors. When German fighters climbed to engage American bombers, the Thunderbolts dove from above, using their superior dive speed to flash through enemy formations at speeds the Germans couldn't match. They fired short, accurate bursts from their 850 caliber machine guns, then used their diving energy to zoom climb back to altitude before German pilots could maneuver for counterattacks. To Luftwaffe pilots trained in the tight-turning, energy-bleeding combat style perfected over Spain and France and Poland, this looked like cowardice. American pilots refused to engage in proper dogfights, wouldn't commit to sustained combat, ran away after single firing passes. German fighter instructors told their students that the P-47 pilots lacked the courage and skill for real aerial combat, that they were cowboys using brute force and superior numbers rather than finesse and tactical sophistication. But the casualty figures told a different story. By January of 1944, P-47 units in the European theater had achieved a kill ratio exceeding 3-to-1 against all German fighter types. The 56th Fighter Group alone had destroyed over 200 German aircraft while losing fewer than 40 of their own. And these victories were accomplished not through superior aircraft performance in traditional terms, but through tactics that exploited characteristics the Germans considered liabilities. The arrival of longer-range drop tanks in late 1943 extended the P-47's combat radius to nearly 400 miles, bringing targets like Berlin and Regensburg within reach. 210-gallon ferry tanks, mounted on reinforced underwing pylons, allowed Thunderbolt groups to escort bomber formations deep into Germany, then drop the tanks and fight their way home with full internal fuel loads. General Jimmy Doolittle, who assumed command of the 8th Air Force in January of 1944, immediately grasped the implications. With enough range to reach any target in Germany, with tactics proven effective against Luftwaffe interceptors, the P-47 groups could do more than simply protect bombers. They could hunt the Luftwaffe wherever it appeared, force it into combat on American terms, and destroy it through systematic attrition. On January 8th, Doolittle issued new orders to his fighter commanders. Their primary mission was no longer close escort of bomber formations. They were to destroy German fighters, in the air and on the ground, by any means available. Fighter groups were authorized to leave the bomber stream, to pursue German formations to their airfields, to strafe parked aircraft and attack any targets of opportunity encountered during their missions. The psychological impact on German pilots was immediate and profound. For 2 years, they had operated under the certainty that American fighters would remain with the bombers, that their attacks on the heavy bomber formations would be contested but ultimately predictable. Now, P-47s appeared at German airfields just as fighters were taking off or attempting to land. They dove on formations that were still assembling for their attacks. They pursued damaged German fighters all the way to the ground, giving wounded pilots no chance to escape. Hauptmann Heinz Bahr, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced aces with over 200 victories, reported to his superiors that the P-47 could absorb an astounding amount of battle damage and had to be handled very carefully. German pilots were discovering that their 20mm cannon shells, devastating against Allied bombers, often failed to bring down the heavily armored Thunderbolt. Pilots returned with stories of P-47s flying home with massive holes in their fuselages, damaged engines, and shattered canopies, aircraft that by rights should have fallen from the sky but continued flying through sheer structural integrity. The stage was set for Operation Argument, The week-long offensive designed to break the Luftwaffe's ability to contest Allied air superiority before the planned invasion of France. Allied intelligence estimated that the Luftwaffe could muster between 1,500 and 2,000 fighters for the defense of the Reich. The plan was brutally simple. Launch massive attacks on aircraft factories, ball-bearing plants, and other critical industrial targets deep inside Germany, force the Luftwaffe to defend those targets with everything it had, and destroy German fighters faster than the training schools could replace their pilots. The weather had delayed the operation for weeks. Strategic bombing required clear skies over the targets, and February's clouds had stubbornly covered central Germany day after day. But on the morning of February 20th, meteorologists detected a break in the weather pattern, a brief window of clear conditions that might last 5 or 6 days. General Karl Spaatz, commanding U.S. strategic air forces in Europe, gave the order. Let them go. At airfields across England, ground crews prepared over 1,000 heavy bombers and 800 fighters for the mission. The primary targets were aircraft factories at Leipzig and Tudow, critical nodes in Germany's dispersed production network. The 8th Air Force would strike by day, the Royal Air Force by night, giving the Germans no rest, no time to repair damaged facilities, no chance to disperse production before the next wave arrived. The 56th Fighter Group, flying from Boxted in Essex, would provide top cover for the bomber stream. The 4th Fighter Group, recently transitioned from P-47s to the longer-range P-51 Mustang, would fly penetration support. The 78th Fighter Group would sweep ahead of the bombers, clearing German fighters from the approach routes. 16 fighter groups in all, over 500 P-47 Thunderbolts and nearly 300 P-51 Mustangs, the largest fighter force ever assembled for a single mission. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Johnson, operations officer of the 56th Fighter Group, briefed his pilots in the pre-dawn darkness. The mission profile was straightforward but dangerous. They would climb to 28,000 feet over the North Sea, cross into Germany at maximum altitude, and position themselves 5,000 feet above the bomber formation. German fighters would attempt to intercept the bombers before they reached the target. The P-47s would dive on any German formation that came within range, using their altitude advantage and diving speed to break up attacks before they could develop. But Johnson added a critical modification to the standard escort tactics. Any P-47 that completed a firing pass and found itself separated from the main formation was authorized to seek targets of opportunity, specifically German airfields within range. Doolittle's new orders meant that individual Thunderbolts or two-ship elements could hunt independently, maximizing the pressure on German pilots who could no longer predict where American fighters would appear. The formation crossed the Dutch coast at 0915, a river of aluminum and steel stretching 40 miles from vanguard to rear guard. German radar stations detected them immediately, and within minutes, Luftwaffe fighter controllers were scrambling every available aircraft to intercept. At bases throughout northern Germany, pilots ran to their fighters, engines fired, and Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs clawed for altitude, racing to position themselves for attacks on the bomber stream. At 27,000 feet, Johnson's formation maintained its position above and behind the lead bomber group. Through his canopy, he could see the contrails of the bombers stretched out below, white lines against the iron-gray earth. Ahead, more contrails appeared, climbing up from the German airfields, converging on the bomber route. The Luftwaffe was coming up in strength. The first engagement occurred at 0942, when a formation of approximately 40 Bf-109s attempted to position themselves for a head-on attack on the lead bomber group. Johnson rolled his flight into a diving attack, his wingman tight on his right. The P-47s accelerated past 400 miles per hour, closing the distance to the climbing Messerschmitts in seconds. Johnson selected his target, a Bf-109 painted in the mottled gray and green camouflage of Jagdgeschwader 11, and opened fire at 800 yards range. The 50 caliber rounds walked across the sky, converging on the Messerschmitt's engine cowling. Smoke erupted from the German fighter's engine, then flame. The pilot rolled inverted and bailed out, his parachute blossoming just as Johnson's Thunderbolt roared past. Johnson pulled back on the stick, using his dive speed to zoom climb back to 28,000 feet, arriving at his original altitude with enough energy to immediately engage another target if one appeared. His wingman had destroyed a second Bf-109 in the same pass. 2 German fighters down in less than 30 seconds, and the American pilots were already back at altitude, ready to repeat the attack. The remaining Messerschmitts scattered, their formation broken before they could threaten the bombers. German flight leaders, trained to press home their attacks regardless of fighter opposition, found themselves facing a tactical problem they had no doctrine to solve. If they continued climbing toward the bombers, the P-47s would dive on them again. If they turned to engage the Thunderbolts, they surrendered their altitude advantage and the bombers continued unmolested to the target. The pattern repeated throughout the mission. German fighters climbed, American fighters dove, and the high-speed slashing attacks broke up interception attempts before they could develop into serious threats to the bomber formations. By the time the lead bombers reached Leipzig, German fighter controllers had scrambled over 200 interceptors, but coordinated attacks proved impossible. The P-47s were everywhere, diving from above, shooting up climbing formations, then zooming back to altitude before German pilots could maneuver for counterattacks. Major Francis Gabreski, commanding officer of the 61st Fighter Squadron, destroyed 2 FW-190s in a single diving pass, his gun camera footage showing both German fighters exploding within seconds of each other. Lieutenant Colonel David Schilling got 3 Bf-109s, executing perfect high-side attacks that caught the German pilots in vulnerable climbing turns. Across the entire fighter force, the new tactics were working with devastating effectiveness. German pilots, those who survived the day's combat, returned to their bases with reports that must have sounded like excuses to their commanders. The Americans wouldn't fight properly. They attacked from above and ran away before we could engage them. They refused to turn, used speed instead of maneuver, exploited their altitude advantage rather than accepting honorable combat at equal terms. But this wasn't cowardice or poor airmanship. This was the systematic application of tactics designed around the specific characteristics of the P-47 Thunderbolt. American pilots understood that their aircraft was faster in a dive than any German fighter, more robust, capable of sustaining damage that would destroy a Messerschmitt. They understood that altitude was more valuable than maneuver, that energy management trumped turning radius, that a pilot who survived to fight another day was more useful than one who died trying to prove his courage in an unequal contest. The losses on February 20th were modest by the standards of earlier raids. 21 American bombers failed to return, far fewer than the catastrophic casualties of the Schweinfurt-Regensburg missions in August and October of 1943. But the Luftwaffe lost 74 fighters in aerial combat, including 14 Bf-110 twin-engine heavy fighters, devastating specialist aircraft that carried the rocket launchers and heavy cannon needed to break up bomber formations. More significantly, experienced Luftwaffe pilots were beginning to die at a rate the training schools could not replace. Of the 74 German fighters destroyed on February 20th, at least 20 were flown by pilots with more than 100 combat missions. These were squadron leaders, flight commanders, the cadre of experienced aviators whose tactical knowledge and combat skills formed the backbone of the Reich's air defense. Once killed, they were essentially irreplaceable. The weather held on February 21st, and over 800 bombers launched for strikes on Luftwaffe airfields at Diepholz, Gütersloh, Lippstadt, and multiple other targets. The goal was to destroy German fighters on the ground, catch them during takeoff or landing, disrupt the command and control infrastructure that allowed Luftwaffe fighter controllers to coordinate interceptions. Nearly 700 American fighters provided escort, but with the new roving commission, large numbers of P-47s and P-51s left the bomber stream to hunt independently. Major Glenn Duncan, the aggressive Texan who had pioneered low-level strafing tactics in the P-47, led his 353rd Fighter Group in a sweep ahead of the bomber formation. At 15,000 feet over Lower Saxony, Duncan spotted a German airfield with approximately 30 fighters visible on the ground. Without hesitation, he rolled into a diving attack, his squadron following in trail. The P-47 screamed across the airfield at nearly 500 miles per hour, barely 50 feet above the ground, their 50 caliber guns tearing through parked Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. The flames from burning aircraft rose 200 feet into the morning sky as Duncan's squadron pulled off the target and climbed back to altitude. In less than 3 minutes, They had destroyed or damaged more than a dozen German fighters without firing a single shot in air-to-air combat. This was a new kind of warfare, and it violated every romantic notion the Luftwaffe had about aerial combat. Fighters were supposed to duel with other fighters in the sky, not strafe defenseless aircraft on the ground like ground attack aircraft. But American commanders had no interest in romantic notions. They had a simple calculus. A German fighter destroyed on the ground killed no American bomber crews. A Luftwaffe pilot caught during takeoff or landing was just as dead as one shot down at altitude. And the tactical advantages of ground attack were overwhelming. German fighters at their airfields couldn't maneuver, couldn't use their superior turning radius, couldn't exploit any of the characteristics that made them dangerous in air combat. The losses on February 21st reflected this new reality. 19 American bombers failed to return, but the Luftwaffe lost 60 German fighters in aerial combat and an estimated 40 more destroyed on the ground. More critically, replacement pilots were now dying faster than the training schools could produce them. Of the 60 fighters lost in air combat, at least 18 were flown by pilots with more than 50 missions. These were flight leaders, the experienced cadre who had survived the brutal attrition of the Eastern Front and knew how to keep inexperienced wingmen alive. German fighter controllers were beginning to recognize a terrible truth. The Americans were fighting a war of industrial attrition, and Germany was losing. Every mission cost the Luftwaffe irreplaceable experienced pilots. Every strafing attack destroyed aircraft that took weeks to replace. And the American losses, while significant, were being made good by a production system that could replace both aircraft and trained aircrews faster than combat consumed them. February 22nd brought weather that should have grounded both sides. Cloud cover blanketed most of central Germany, and forecasters predicted conditions would worsen throughout the day. But the Americans launched anyway, determined to maintain the pressure regardless of bombing accuracy. The primary targets were aircraft factories at Schweinfurt, Gotha, and Ostersleben, critical nodes in Germany's fighter production network. The mission became a catastrophe of coordination failures and impossible flying conditions. Bomber formations struggled to assemble in the overcast. Fighter escorts lost visual contact with their charges in the clouds. Groups diverted to secondary targets or turned back entirely when their primary objectives proved impossible to reach. And the Germans, exploiting the chaos, launched concentrated attacks against separated bomber formations. The B-24s dispatched to Gotha suffered particularly heavy casualties. After missing their rendezvous with P-51 escort fighters, they found themselves facing waves of Bf-109s and FW-190s. German pilots, sensing an opportunity to inflict maximum damage on an underprotected formation, pressed their attacks with suicidal determination. Some climbed directly through the bomber formations, firing their cannons at point-blank range, willing to risk collision for a certain kill. Lieutenant Horace Torrell, navigator aboard the B-24 Dixie Dudrop of the 703rd Bomb Squadron, later recalled that his crew had bad premonitions about this mission from the start. The feeling proved justified. German fighters attacked continuously from the initial point through the bomb run and for more than an hour after bombs away. The squadron's Hollywood actor commander, Jimmy Stewart, would later describe it as the most intense combat he experienced during the war. 41 American bombers failed to return from the missions on February 22nd, the highest single-day loss of Big Week. But the Luftwaffe's victory was Pyrrhic. German controllers had committed everything they had to stopping the raids, and American fighters had been waiting. P-47 groups, freed from close escort duties and authorized to hunt independently, tore through German formations with devastating efficiency. Major Francis Gabreski, already an ace with 13 victories, added 3 more Bf-109s to his score. Lieutenant Colonel David Schilling destroyed 2 FW-190s in a single diving pass. Across the entire fighter force, American pilots claimed over 70 German fighters destroyed. The actual number was probably lower, overclaiming being endemic in aerial combat, but German records confirmed that the Luftwaffe lost at least 50 fighters that day, with 33 pilots killed. The strategic significance went beyond the numbers. German fighter units were now forced to operate at altitudes where the P-47's performance advantages were most pronounced. Luftwaffe pilots who attempted to climb above 30,000 feet to attack bombers found Thunderbolts waiting, operating in their optimal performance envelope where the massive fighter's power and speed gave it overwhelming tactical superiority. The weather broke on February 23, granting both sides a day of rest. Ground crews worked through the cold English night, repairing battle damage, replacing engines, patching hundreds of bullet holes in aircraft that had limped home from Germany. American intelligence officers compiled loss reports and began to understand the scale of what was happening. They were not simply disrupting German fighter production. They were destroying the Luftwaffe's ability to train and maintain a force capable of contesting Allied air superiority. German intelligence officers were reaching similar conclusions with considerably more alarm. Reports from Jagdgeschwader commanders painted a grim picture. Experienced flight leaders were dead. New pilots were arriving at operational squadrons with insufficient training. Aircraft losses were mounting faster than replacements could be distributed. And the Americans showed no signs of relenting. February 24 brought clear skies over Germany and the most intensive single day of combat in the entire week. Over 260 B-17s were dispatched to Schweinfurt's ball-bearing plants, the same target that had cost the 8th Air Force 60 bombers in October of 1943. 3 combat wings of B-24s headed for Gotha. 5 more combat wings targeted aircraft plants in northern Germany. Nearly 700 fighters provided escort and conducted independent sweeps. The difference from the earlier Schweinfurt missions was immediately apparent. P-47s and P-51s swarmed over the bomber formations at multiple altitudes, making coordinated German attacks nearly impossible. When Luftwaffe fighters attempted to assemble for mass attacks, American fighters dove on them before they could organize. German pilots found themselves fighting defensive battles just to survive, let alone threaten the bombers. Major Glenn Duncan, leading the 353rd Fighter Group, demonstrated exactly why the Germans were learning to fear the P-47. At 28,000 feet over Schweinfurt, he spotted a formation of approximately 30 Bf-109s climbing toward the bombers. Duncan rolled into a near-vertical dive, his wingmen following, and accelerated past 450 miles per hour. The closing speed was so high that the German formation had no time to react. Duncan opened fire at 600 yards, his 8 machine guns converging their streams on the lead Messerschmitt. The German fighter exploded, debris from its engine and cockpit scattering across the sky. Duncan pulled out of his dive with enough energy to zoom climb back to 26,000 feet, arriving at altitude before the remaining German fighters could maneuver to engage him. His wingmen destroyed a second Bf-109 in the same pass, and the entire German formation broke apart, individual pilots diving away to escape the high-speed attacks they had no doctrine to counter. The bombing at Gotha was especially accurate. Over 400 bombs, both high explosive and incendiary, fell in the target area. 93 hit buildings in the Gotha wagon fabric complex, the largest producer of Me-210 twin-engine fighters in Germany. Post-raid reconnaissance photographs showed entire assembly buildings destroyed, machine tools scattered by explosions, and fires still burning hours after the attack. But the real battle was being fought in the sky above the bombers. The Luftwaffe had committed over 300 fighters to defending the day's targets, and American escort fighters met them with tactics the Germans still couldn't counter. The P-47's combination of altitude advantage, dive speed, and structural strength proved devastating. German pilots who tried to escape by diving found Thunderbolts staying with them past 500 miles per hour. Those who tried to climb found American fighters already positioned above them, ready to dive. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The intensity of the combat was reflected in the ammunition expenditure. P-47 groups returned to their bases with empty guns, having fired every round in extended combat. Gun cameras showed German fighters being hit multiple times but continuing to fly, their pilots either incredibly lucky or incredibly skilled. Other footage showed fighters simply disintegrating under the concentrated fire of 850 caliber machine guns, pieces of wing and fuselage spinning away as the aircraft broke apart. German pilots who survived the day's combat filed reports that read like excerpts from a nightmare. The Americans were everywhere. Their fighters appeared from impossible angles, struck with overwhelming firepower, then disappeared before counterattacks could develop. Luftwaffe squadron commanders reported that their pilots were becoming reluctant to engage, that the psychological impact of fighting an enemy who seemed to have every advantage was eroding combat effectiveness. Lieutenant Heinrich Oehler, a Luftwaffe ace with over 200 victories on the Eastern Front, found his experience meant nothing against the new American tactics. In a combat over central Germany on February 24th, he led his Staffel in a climbing attack toward a bomber formation, exactly as doctrine required. P-47s dove on them from above before they reached the bombers. Oehler's wingman was killed instantly, his Bf-109 exploding in a fireball. Oehler himself barely escaped, diving away at maximum speed, while 50 caliber rounds chewed through his aircraft's tail section. He made it back to his airfield, his fighter riddled with bullet holes, and filed a report that was brutally honest. The Americans had complete tactical superiority. Their fighters were faster in a dive, could absorb more damage, and were flown by pilots who understood exactly how to exploit those advantages. Unless the Luftwaffe developed new tactics or received significantly better aircraft, the situation would only deteriorate. His superiors ignored the report. They had been receiving similar assessments from squadron commanders across the fighter force, and they had no solution to offer. German aircraft production was focused on quantity over quality. New fighters rolling off assembly lines had reduced performance compared to earlier models because simplified production techniques prioritized numbers over refinement. And the training program couldn't produce pilots fast enough to replace combat losses. The final day of Big Week, February 25th, saw the largest American effort yet. Over 290 B-17s targeted aircraft plants at Regensburg, Augsburg, and Fürth. Nearly 160 B-24s struck at Stuttgart. The 15th Air Force, operating from Italy, attacked Regensburg simultaneously, the first major coordinated mission between the two strategic air forces. Over 600 fighters provided escort and flew independent sweeps. German resistance was noticeably weaker. Fighter controllers could muster fewer than 200 interceptors, and many of those were held back to defend specific high-priority targets. The Luftwaffe was exhausted. 5 days of intensive combat had killed experienced pilots, destroyed aircraft faster than they could be replaced, and shattered the morale of survivors who understood they were fighting a losing battle. American losses on February 25th were the lightest of the entire week. 31 bombers failed to return, and 3 fighters were lost. The Germans lost approximately 70 fighters, continuing the pattern of attrition that was bleeding the WWII. More significantly, German fighter production facilities had suffered significant damage. The Messerschmitt plants at Regensburg and Augsburg both sustained hits that would delay production for weeks. When the final mission of Big Week landed back in England, American intelligence officers began compiling the statistics that would define the operation's success. Over nearly 4,000 heavy bomber sorties, the 8th Air Force had dropped more bombs in 1 week than during its entire first year of operations. 227 bombers had been lost, along with 42 fighters. More than 5,000 American airmen were killed, wounded, or captured. But the Luftwaffe's losses were catastrophic by comparison. The Germans had lost over 350 single-engine fighters in aerial combat, with perhaps another 100 destroyed on the ground. Equipment losses, while serious, could eventually be replaced through Germany's still-functioning production network. But the pilot losses were irreplaceable. 17% of the Luftwaffe's fighter pilots had been killed during Big Week. Nearly 100 experienced aviators, many with over 50 combat missions, were dead. These were the flight leaders, the veterans who understood how to fight in the vertical maneuvering combat that now dominated aerial warfare. Their loss meant that replacement pilots would arrive at operational squadrons with no experienced leaders to learn from, no tactical wisdom passed down from veterans who had survived and adapted. The psychological impact extended beyond the immediate casualties. German pilots who survived Big Week understood they had been comprehensively outfought. Not through superior individual courage or skill, but through tactical doctrine that exploited aircraft characteristics the Luftwaffe had dismissed as irrelevant. The P-47's weight, once considered a liability, was the source of its devastating dive speed. Its size, mocked by German pilots as making it easy to see and target, housed the armor and structural strength that allowed it to absorb battle damage and keep flying. Its apparent lack of maneuverability at low altitude was irrelevant when flown from high altitude in vertical diving attacks. General Major Adolf Galland, reviewing the week's combat reports, drafted a memorandum to Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring that painted the situation in stark terms. The Americans had achieved tactical air superiority over Germany. Their fighter tactics were superior to German doctrine. Their pilots were better trained. Their aircraft, when flown properly, were more effective in the combat environments where battles were actually being fought. And their production capacity meant they could sustain losses that would cripple the Luftwaffe. Göring's response was to blame the fighter pilots for cowardice, to insist that German pilots lacked the fighting spirit of earlier years. This was precisely the kind of leadership that would doom the Luftwaffe to irrelevance by the time of the Normandy invasion 4 months later. The men flying Bf-109s and Fw-190s over Germany in February of 1944 weren't cowards. They were fighting with desperate courage against an enemy that had simply developed better tactics for the machines available to both sides. The broader strategic impact of Big Week extended far beyond the immediate combat results. Allied planners, studying the statistics, concluded that air superiority over Western Europe was achievable before the planned invasion of France. The Luftwaffe could no longer concentrate enough fighters to seriously threaten strategic bombing missions. German fighter production, while still significant, couldn't replace both aircraft and trained pilots fast enough to reverse the attrition equation. More subtly, Big Week validated the entire concept of long-range escort fighters. Earlier theories of strategic bombing had assumed that heavy bombers, flying in tight defensive formations, could fight their way to and from targets without fighter escort. The catastrophic losses of 1943 had proven that theory wrong. But Big Week demonstrated that properly employed escort fighters could protect bombers while simultaneously destroying the enemy air force. The P-47, despite its initial limitations, had proven to be exactly the weapon needed for this mission. The Germans had called P-47 pilots reckless cowboys, undisciplined amateurs who refused to fight proper aerial combat. They were wrong on every count. The American fighter pilots over Germany in February of 1944 were executing a carefully developed tactical doctrine that maximized their aircraft strengths while avoiding combat in regimes where German fighters held advantages. They weren't avoiding honorable combat. They were refusing to fight their opponent's fight, forcing the Luftwaffe into aerial battles where American advantages were overwhelming. Colonel Hubert Zemke, whose 56th Fighter Group had destroyed more German aircraft during Big Week than any other American unit, summarized the lesson in a briefing to his pilots after the last mission. They had proven that altitude was more valuable than agility, that patience was more deadly than aggression, that surviving to fight another day was better tactics than dying in pursuit of a single victory. The Thunderbolt, flown according to these principles, was the finest fighter in the European theater for the mission it was designed to accomplish. German pilots who survived the war and later wrote memoirs consistently described the P-47 with wary respect. It wasn't the fastest fighter they faced. It wasn't the most maneuverable. But it was the most dangerous because it was flown by pilots who understood exactly how to use it. When a formation of P-47s appeared at 30,000 feet, German pilots knew they were about to be attacked in a way they couldn't effectively counter. The American fighters would dive faster than pursuit was possible, fire accurately at high closing speeds, then climb back to safety before defensive maneuvers could bring guns to bear. The tactical innovations developed during Big Week, particularly the emphasis on altitude advantage and high-speed diving attacks, became standard doctrine throughout the American fighter forces. P-51 Mustang groups, taking over long-range escort duties as the war progressed, adopted the same basic principles. The specific performance characteristics differed, the Mustang being faster and more maneuverable than the Thunderbolt, but the underlying philosophy remained consistent. Control altitude, control the battle. Force the enemy to fight on your terms. Exploit your aircraft's strengths. Avoid situations where the enemy's advantages can be brought to bear. By March of 1944, the Luftwaffe had effectively lost the air war over Western Europe. German fighters still rose to contest American bombing raids, still achieved occasional tactical victories, still killed American airmen. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. The attrition equation was unsustainable. Every mission cost the Luftwaffe irreplaceable pilots. Every week brought more American fighters, more bombers, more trained aircrews flooding into England. The invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, proceeded under near-total Allied air superiority. The Luftwaffe managed to fly exactly 2 sorties over the invasion beaches on D-Day. 2 aircraft out of an air force that 4 months earlier could still muster hundreds of fighters for a single mission. The difference was Big Week and the systematic destruction of German fighter strength that followed. What the Luftwaffe had dismissed as cowboy tactics turned out to be the future of air combat. Energy management, altitude advantage, high-speed diving attacks, all would become fundamental principles of jet fighter tactics in later decades. The Germans were still trying to fight the war they had mastered over Spain and France in the late 1930s. The Americans had adapted their tactics to the machines they had and the war they were actually fighting. The cost was measured in more than statistics. 5,000 American airmen killed, wounded, or captured during Big Week. Each one of them was somebody's son, husband, brother, father. Each bomber that went down took 10 men with it. Each fighter pilot who failed to return left an empty bunk and grieving friends. The strategic necessity of the campaign didn't diminish the individual tragedies it created. But the alternative would have been worse. Without air superiority, the invasion of France might have failed. Without the systematic destruction of the Luftwaffe during Big Week and the months that followed, D-Day could have turned into a catastrophe of unprecedented scale. The men who died over Germany in February of 1944 helped ensure that when Allied armies finally landed on French beaches, they did so under skies owned by Allied aircraft. The final irony was that the Germans never truly understood why they lost. Göring blamed the fighter pilots. Hitler blamed defeatism. Neither recognized that they had been outthought tactically and overwhelmed industrially. The Luftwaffe's pre-war doctrine, so effective in the opening years of conflict, had become obsolete. The Americans didn't win because they had better aircraft, though the P-47 was formidable when properly employed. They won because they developed tactics that exploited their advantages and neutralized German strengths. The P-47 pilots weren't cowboys. They were professionals executing a doctrine that had been carefully developed through analysis of combat reports, understanding of aircraft performance characteristics, and ruthless focus on what actually worked in combat rather than what romantic notions suggested should work. The Germans paid for their contempt with hundreds of dead pilots and the loss of air superiority over their own homeland. Big Week ended on February 25, 1944. But the lessons learned during those 6 days of intensive combat would shape air warfare for generations. Altitude equals energy. Energy equals life. The fighter that controls altitude controls the battle. And the pilot who understands his aircraft's strengths and fights to exploit them will defeat an opponent with superior individual machines but inferior tactical doctrine. The Luftwaffe called them reckless cowboys right up until the moment they lost 400 fighters and the air war over Germany. After that, they called them something else entirely. They called them deadly. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.